Good morning and welcome. Thanks for joining us for House Calls, Real Docs, Real Talk. I'm your host, Mercedes Fuller, back for some more healthy conversation. Well, this summer is coming to a close, and that's so unfortunate. It's time to already start thinking about back to school. Can you believe that? But this year is a little different in the wake of remote learning. Some kids are way behind, and a lot of kids are even struggling with the stress of returning to a physical classroom after a year of virtual learning. It's a real tricky situation, but luckily we've got some wonderful advice to share with you today. Let's get started. With me this morning is our friend Dr. Kayla N. Lopez, Associate Professor and Pediatrics Director of Transition Medicine at the Division of Pediatric Cardiology at Texas Children's Hospital, right at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. Dr. Lopez, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here today.
Absolutely. We are so happy to have you here because this is such an important conversation that I'm excited to have today. Let's jump into today's discussion with my favorite segment. We call it Health in the Headlines. Good health is always newsworthy, so each week we select a current headline that ties back to our topic at hand. We bring it to our table, and then we ask our amazing expert to respond. This week's entry comes to us from CNN, and the title is Children Slept Over an Hour More with Mindfulness Training, a Study Finds. Dr. Lopez, now, I'm a big fan of sleep when I can get it. So what are your thoughts about this article?
I'm also a big fan of sleep when I can get it. So I agree with you. And actually, sleep is even more important if you're a child or a preteen or a teenager. I think the average preteen and child is supposed to get anywhere between 9 to 12 hours of sleep, which people often don't realize. And teenagers are supposed to get anywhere from 8 to 10 hours of sleep. But there's been studies that have shown that 70% of high schoolers are getting less than 8 hours of sleep. That's over half, and that's really concerning because we know that not getting enough sleep has long-term health implications in terms of obesity and heart health and diabetes. And there's been studies that have been shown from the Journal of the American Medical Association that less sleep is actually associated with more behavioral issues and safety issues, including risky behaviors, aggressive behaviors, alcohol, and even mood and self-harm. There's been studies that have shown that the less sleep you get, the more likely you are to have suicidal thoughts and things of that nature. And so the American Academy of Pediatrics has called the lack of sleep in the childhood period and in the adolescent period an epidemic of sorts, and have been really advocating for this. And so anything that can help increase child sleep and the quality of their sleep, including mindfulness, helping children learn to relax and things of that nature, is a win for me. I think that's fantastic.
Wow. Just hearing how important sleep is, it makes me want to kind of reconsider my daily schedule and put that nap back in the schedule. Do you remember when we were in elementary school and we had like that nap in pre-K and kindergarten? Now I see that nap was really critical. So we have to check our schedules. Let's get into our main segment to answer our viewer questions. We call it You Ask, We Answer. Doctor, so many questions. And as we're preparing for this school year, it won't be just about buying pencils and paper and our lunch kits. It's also about getting our kids ready for the re-entry and trying to do this as stress-free as possible. We have lots of questions about this. So here we go. Our first question comes to us from Marcella in South Dakota. And Marcella is wondering, how can I help lessen my child's anxiety and prepare them for returning to school?
So that's a really great question, particularly given that this is a school year, as you stated, unlike any other, because the preceding school year was so different. So I think one of the best things that parents can do is to open a dialogue with their child and get an understanding of the source of anxiety, if they have anxiety, about going back to school from the very outset? Is the anxiety because they're afraid of getting COVID when they go back to school? Is the anxiety because they're afraid of social interactions, having been virtual for so long? Is there anxiety because they're starting a new school and they're anxious about making friends? So these are a lot of the areas where children will have anxiety in going back to school after a year like we had. And so if you have a young child or one that's going to be in elementary school and they're experiencing anxiety for going back to school, try to talk to them frequently about school. Talk about fun memories that they had at school. Talk about their friends, their teachers, and be enthusiastic. And that will help lessen their anxiety about going back to school. You may also want to contact their teacher and have a face-to-face, or virtual discussion with their teacher and the child, so the child knows who the teacher is going to be, and that can help and lessen their anxiety as well. If you have a junior high student or a high schooler who might be concerned, understanding that they might need some extra support moving through a new building or a bigger high school, just like any other year, would be pretty important. And encouraging them in ways that previously maybe you hadn't, saying, hey, this is going to be a different year, kind of acknowledging what's happened in the past year and saying, let's strategize what we can do if you're having a harder time getting back into the groove, or trying to figure out what activities you like to be involved in. And all of these things, I think, can help reduce their anxiety. The last thing I want to say about this is, did your child have anxiety before the COVID lockdown, before virtual learning? And if the answer to that is yes, then some of those children may be at a higher risk for having anxiety going back to school. And I think a recognition of that and kind of preempting those discussions more actively with those children would be really, really important. So having discussions about social contact, social relationships, and maybe walking by the school, driving by the school, kind of getting some familiarity with the school would be really important.
Wow, so many important tips. And it's so amazing how the different grade levels and the different categories of students, the tips vary. It's so important. As a former teacher, I can always vouch for some of those tips that you've shared. So thank you so much for that. Here's a question for us from Tony in Syracuse, and he's wondering, with remote learning last year, I'm concerned that my child is behind or will have trouble adapting to an in-person learning environment. Do you see a long-term impact academically or socially from virtual learning?
There's been a lot of evidence that students who were learning virtually were not getting all of the curriculum or instruction that they needed or that they would typically have gotten during in-person learning. And the research would indicate that some students are at a higher risk than others, with a few even falling one or two grade levels behind, particularly in reading and in math. And there was a report from some educators with the McKinsey group from March of 2021, and they asked teachers to rank how they felt the effectiveness of remote learning had gone for their students. And not surprisingly, teachers that worked in high poverty schools with limited resources found it to be especially ineffective, rating virtual learning a 3 out of 10, and bolstering concerns that the pandemic can exacerbate or has exacerbated any educational inequalities that existed or continues to exist. Teachers in wealthier and private schools also tend to report more difficult learning, but those students were more equipped with internet access and devices. They also had more access to assistance from parents and colleagues. And so that was very, very helpful to those students. And so recognizing the differences in who had what during the virtual learning experience will kind of help us to recognize what the long-term impact might be. We can't really entirely gauge what the long-term impact is at this time because not enough time has passed. But many educators and researchers thankfully feel that kids, if they get the support that they need in this upcoming school year, can actually catch up from the deficits that they had from the COVID year that they experienced in the virtual learning environment. So educators say, in order for them to catch up, it's going to take some very hard work by administrators, by teachers, by families, to have an ongoing dialogue and to be clear and communicative about what everybody needs, and to make sure that kids are identified that are at high risk so they can get the help that they need to catch up.
Absolutely. Great advice. Hard work, communication, and just the right support. Great advice, doctor. Here's one from Robin in Canada. Can you explain what mental health and wellness is in children, what that means for children?
So there are some very well-defined definitions for what mental health and wellness means in children. In the most clinical of terms, it means reaching developmental and emotional milestones and then learning healthy social skills and how to cope. This is very important now, how to cope when there is a problem. That's a big part of mental health wellness. Mentally healthy children have a positive quality of life, and they can function well not only at school, but also at home and within their communities.
Absolutely. We have another very important question. It's coming from Doreen. And this is an important question for not only parents, teachers, and those support systems that we were talking about. Listen to this. What signs should I look out for that my child is under distress or is struggling with their mental health? Are there different signs that I should be looking for in my elementary school child versus my high school child?
That's a lot of stuff to unpack in that question. So I'm going to try to have some general assistance with that. So symptoms of mental health challenges can change over time, as the question alluded to, depending on what stage the child is in. And so, this may include difficulties in how they play or how they learn or how they act or how they handle their emotions, particularly if they're younger. So symptoms of mental health struggles often happen in early childhood, and some of these develop even further into the teenage years. So they often start when the child is younger. And the diagnosis for these can often be made in the school year, although a lot of times children go undiagnosed for a very long time and are kind of labeled as being problem children, which is an issue. So some examples of these mental health disorders include anxiety, depression, ADHD, post-traumatic stress, just to name a few. It's important to recognize that mental health disorders can affect any child of any gender, of any age, and it's estimated that anywhere up to 20% of kids pre-pandemic had mental health disorders, and that has only kind of escalated since COVID started. So general things that we can think about in terms of stressors for kids, or ways that we can identify stressors, are some physical attributes. Have they exhibited a decreased appetite? Are they constantly complaining of headaches or stomach aches? Is there new bedwetting? Are they having nightmares? And having lots of physical symptoms even when they're not actually ill. There's also emotional and behavioral symptoms that we can look out for, and this is kind of regardless of age. Just the inability to relax, having kind of fears that are out of proportion to what they're going to face, not being able to let you out of their sight, kind of being clingy for younger children, having aggressive behavior, not being able to control their emotions. And then for younger kids, regressing in terms of their behaviors, doing things they used to do when they were toddlers, even though they're older children. So those are all kind of signs and symptoms that something might be going on. And I think for teenagers in particular, given the mental health distress that teenagers had in this COVID year, really, really paying attention to your teenagers' behavior. Are they withdrawn? Are they quiet? Are they interacting socially with friends? Those are all very, very important signs.
Absolutely. So many important signs to look out for. Here's one from Carlos in Arizona. How can I help my child feel comfortable about talking about their mental health?
Parents are wired to fix things for their children. They're wired to fix problems for the children. That's what you want to do. You want to fix a kid's issue because they're your child. The best thing a parent can do is to listen, is to learn to listen, actively listen, repeat back to the child to make sure you're understanding what they're saying and not run to fix things. Listening opens the door to a conversation that can be longer lasting. And that is really the number one thing that you can do. Other things include spending quality time with your child. That makes it more likely for them to talk to you. Being careful about what they're watching or reading or listening to or seeing. Being conscious that while you're an adult and you can handle those things, they might not be able to handle those things, even though you think, oh, they're probably fine. Be a role model. Talk about your feelings. Talk about what it feels like sometimes when you were stressed or frustrated or anxious and how you coped with it. And then some other helpful things include giving a kid choices. If a kid feels like they have choices, they feel like they're more in control. And that will help open the doors to a conversation. And then finally, making sure a kid feels that you recognize their worth. Giving a child a sense of self-worth, encouragement, affection, using rewards instead of punishments. All of those things will actually open dialogues and assist in opening the dialogue to getting a child to talk to you about how they're feeling.
Absolutely. It's clear there that encouragement is key. Encouragement is key. Thank you for that, doctor. Here's one from Nancy. This is what she wonders. Should I encourage my child to communicate any mental issues to their teacher or school nurse?
I think if you have significant concerns about your child's anxiety, depression, etc., or there's been some tumultuous activity at home, if there's a new divorce, moving to a new area, anything that you feel might be really anxiety provoking to a child, or they have exhibited signs of anxiety, yes, I would absolutely encourage talking to a teacher or a school nurse for them to help kind of monitor your child and make sure that there's not something that's even, kind of more obvious that's happening during the school day. Because things, as parents, you tend to find things out later as it comes to school. When the grades come in and you see that the grades are not great, you say, oh my word, what happened here? But the teachers and the school nurse have much more frequent contact during the day with the child in the environment that might be stressing them out the most. And it would be really, really helpful to kind of give them a heads up about some of the concerns that you have, without making the child feel like there's, quote, something wrong with them. Normalize emotions, normalize talking about how you feel and making sure that you can, best cope with your feelings.
Absolutely. Dr. Lopez, we've got a few more questions left. How about this one from Gloria? What are the differences between a therapist, psychiatrist, and psychologist?
So thankfully, we have all three, because I think it's pretty clear that in the U.S., we have a shortage of mental health providers, generally speaking. And so having at least three levels of providers is very helpful. So a psychologist specializes in the study of behaviors and mental processes, and they often will talk to people about how they interact with their environment as well as other people, and they help understand and handle different life problems and mental health issues. They diagnose and treat mental disorders as well as learning disabilities, as well as behavioral problems. And they often can do psychotherapy or talk therapy. That's often what they are known for, not only in an individual setting, but sometimes in a family setting or in a group setting. So the important, I think, difference here between a psychiatrist and a psychologist is not an MD. They're not a medical doctor. They require an undergraduate major, a master's, and then they get a doctorate or a PhD often, or Phys Sci they call it, in psychology. And so that's kind of one of the main differences. Psychiatrists also specialize in the study and the diagnosis and prevention and treatment of mental, emotional, behavioral, and developmental issues. They often will focus more specifically on chemical imbalances in the brain. So it's a lot of medical treatments that go along with being a psychiatrist. And oftentimes they will partner with psychologists, but they are medical doctors, and they may often partner with psychologists for counseling. Finally, you have the category of therapists, and these are counselors or licensed clinical social workers or licensed family therapists. They kind of all fall under the therapist umbrella, and they provide mental health services as well. They require a master's degree as well as board certified licensing. They work in hospitals and schools and treatment centers, and they often also have a lot of assistance in terms of behavioral therapies and teaching people how to cope with a lot of mental health disorders. And so if they feel like they can't help you and need more medical treatment, they will often refer you to a psychologist or a psychiatrist.
Absolutely. So many support systems available out there. And speaking of those support systems, here's a question from Monica. She's wondering, how can I work with my child's teacher to identify any early issues that may be on the horizon?
Well, I think it's important, particularly in this pandemic year. I think people have since they've been around their child probably more than they had in the past, uh, it's probably important for them to get a gauge on where the child is at this moment and kind of get a gauge on where their mental health is, where their wellness is. And it would be important in cases where you have significant concerns or even moderate concerns about your child to meet with a teacher or the counselor before school starts. And that's the key. Once school starts, things kind of get busy. But before the school starts, to get an awareness of the underlying anxiety that the child may have, and or depression, and to let them know this is where the kid is starting, and to have them look out for things that may have caused anxiety in the first place, like bullying or having anxiety about social interactions, etc. So having those conversations before school starts, I think, is pretty critically important. And there's lots of individuals, not just the teacher, but also the counselors in the school, the principals in the school, that can help in this way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest thing is reaching out and getting that support for those kiddos. Our last question is a pretty good one and very important when we think about our kiddos and the use of social media. Listen to this. Sharon wants to know your thoughts on the relationship between mental health and social media.
That's a very, very complicated question. I would say that most pediatricians prior to COVID, prior to the pandemic, would have said, there's a lot of data that shows that social media is harmful to mental health, that it causes more anxiety and potentially depression because kids compare themselves and they have all these filters that you can make yourself look one way or another. And there was a lot of negative press surrounding social media and mental health. Interestingly, during the time of the pandemic, many children, teens, children, preteens, found that the best strategy to help them cope with the isolation of the pandemic was social media. So for many of them, anxiety and depression actually diminished through the use of social media during the pandemic. So the answer to that complex question is, mental health and social media, how social media is used, when it is used, how often it is used, why it is used, and by whom, all make differences in terms of how it impacts a child's mental health. And I think all of those things should be explored to best know how it's impacting your child and find ways so that social media can be a positive experience, as it was for many during the pandemic, as opposed to a negative one.
Wow. So many important considerations. Dr. Lopez, thank you so much for your time. This new school year is going to be pretty interesting. On the other hand, I'm sure most kids are excited to be with their friends again, but I worry about the learning loss from last year. And I'm not even a parent yet. What do you think about that? Is there anything else that you'd like to add before leaving us today, Dr. Lopez?
I think kids tried their best. I think teachers tried their best during something that was really unprecedented, that most of us were not prepared for. I think giving yourself and your child some grace for what happened during that year is important. It wasn't anyone's fault. It's just we were just kind of victims of the pandemic, if you will. And so I think coming into this new school year with an understanding of there might be some catch up, with an enthusiasm and a desire to help, with a desire to listen, to learn, to actively listen to your child and listen for what's really going on. I think all of those things will be really, really important moving forward, and recognizing that they may need a little more help in the outset. But more importantly, recognizing that keeping the dialogue open with your child at all times, pandemic or not, is critically important to the well-being and mental health of your child.
Absolutely, doctor. That was spot on. We have to continue to give ourselves, our children, our teachers some grace. And you know what? Just take a moment to celebrate our survival and our arrival at a new school year. Thank you so much, doctor. Well, friends, that does it for our show today. While the kids head back to school, House Calls will take a little break for the month of August, but the show will return in September with all new topics, new shows, breaking news, and hopefully a lot of fun information that we'll share with you all. You can find any of our previous shows at AHA's House Calls YouTube playlist. Take some time to get caught up and make sure that you're ready for our new conversations when we return. I hope everyone's school year gets off to a great start. In the meantime, Take care of yourselves and each other. And if you haven't already, go get vaccinated. We'll see you in September.
Learn more about House Calls, Real Docs, Real Talk, and submit your questions at heart.org/housecalls.